Picture this. You have got a patch of heavy clay. When it dries out, it sets like concrete and cracks wide open. When it rains, it turns to gray glue that clings to your boots in great heavy lumps, and every gardener, every website, every neighbor over the fence tells you the exact same thing. Nothing decent grows in clay. You will have to dig it all out and burrow in tons of topsoil before you can grow a thing. And on that exact rock-hard clay, I am going to show you 7 vegetables you can grow so well you would stop buying them, counted down to the one that turns the whole thing on its head, because here is what almost nobody believes. Heavy clay is not the worst soil in the garden. It is quietly one of the richest and most fertile soils there is. There is a whole side of the vegetable shop that does not just cope with heavy clay, it actively grows better in it than it ever would in light, loose, sandy soil, bigger and heavier because the clay hands it exactly what it wants. There are crops that positively prefer to sink their roots into cool, moist, heavy ground, and while your sandy soil neighbor is out watering every single evening and feeding every couple of weeks just to keep things alive, a clay garden quietly holds onto its own water and its own food for you. Let me show you the fast one first, because it is the moment it flips in your head. On the exact ground everyone told you to dig out and replace, you walk out to your clay bed and you cut a full bowl of fresh, tender leaves, about a minute from the soil to your plate, greens that were loving the cool, damp, rich clay while a sandy bed down the road baked bone dry. Salad you cut off solid clay. That is not a fantasy and it is not a trick. A patch of hard cracked clay looks like the worst ground you could farm, but it is quietly sitting on 3 gifts a light, hungry, thirsty, sandy soil fights all year to get. And I will be honest with you in one sentence up front, this is not a loose soil carrot patch. The long straight roots like carrots and parsnips really do fork and stunt in heavy clay, and you grow this the no-dig way, opening the clay with mulch instead of fighting it wet, not digging it over and over. But the clay-built side of the shopping, the brassicas, the beans, the squash, the potatoes, the fruit and the tough greens, does not just tolerate heavy clay, it runs on it, because the clay already beats a light, sandy soil at the 3 things that quietly matter most for these crops. It holds its water and its food instead of letting them wash straight through, so the heavy feeders barely need feeding and you skip the daily watering a sandy bed demands. It grips and anchors the tall, top-heavy crops against the wind where loose soil lets them rock and topple, and it only needs opening, not replacing, because under that hard crust is a nutrient bank richer than any bag of compost you could buy, and all you have to do is unlock it. Give the clay the crops that were made for it instead of fighting it with the ones that were not, and it grows. So here is the countdown, 7 vegetables you can grow in heavy clay and stop buying, starting at number 7 with the fastest win of the lot. Number 7 is the fastest proof the clay works, and it is the crop that quietly thrives on the very thing everyone hates about clay, leafy greens and chard. I am starting here because most people look at a hard clay bed and assume nothing tender could ever grow in it, and they never learn that the cool, moisture-holding ground is exactly what leafy crops want most. Leafy greens, kale, chard, perpetual spinach, and leaf beet are thirsty, hungry crops. They want steady moisture and steady feeding, and they bolt or go tough and bitter the moment a light sandy soil dries out and starves them in a hot week. Heavy clay is the answer to both of those problems at once. Stand a bed of clay, open the top with a good thick mulch of compost, plant your greens and your chard straight into it, and that is the whole job. Here is why the clay wins for these, and it is the surprise that sets up the whole video. The clay holds its water and its food right there in the root zone, so where a sandy bed dries out and the greens bolt, the clay bed stays cool and moist underneath and the greens just keep growing lush and tender, week after week, through dry spells that would finish them anywhere else. And the trick most people miss, harvest them cut and come again, taking only the outer leaves and leaving the growing point, so one planting hands you leaves for weeks and weeks, not one bowl. A clay bed of greens and chard hands you your first homegrown crop, fresh leaves off the exact ground everyone swore was too hard to grow anything, about a minute from the soil to your plate. But if leaves are the fastest thing you can grow off that clay, the next number is the crop that grows straight up out of it and feeds the heavy soil while it does it. Number 6 is the bean that likes it heavy. Number 6 is the crop that shrugs off the cold, heavy, sticky ground that would rot a lot of tender seed, broad beans and peas. Here is the honest bit that makes this number, and it is what most people get wrong. A lot of beans are thirsty crops, and clay is the one soil that never lets them go thirsty, so beans and clay are a natural match. Broad beans especially are tough, hardy legumes that positively like a firm, heavy, moisture-holding soil, and peas and climbing beans crop beautifully in clay because it holds the steady water they drink so hard in summer, exactly when a sandy bed is drying out and dropping its flowers. So you grow the legumes that suit the heavy ground, and you grow them straight up a string or a light frame, turning the one thing a small plot has going spare, the air above it, into a wall of food. Here is why the clay wins, and it is the clever part down in the soil. These are legumes, so they quietly pull nitrogen out of the air and feed it back into the ground, giving something back instead of only taking, which leaves that heavy clay richer and a little more open for whatever you grow next. And they do the generous trick. The more young pods you pick, the more the plant sets, so a single row up a string can hand you tender pods and beans for weeks off ground everyone else wrote off as dead. Lean a slim trellis against a wall, open a strip of the clay with mulch at the bottom, and send them up. You have turned the heavy plot's spare air into a living wall of beans, fed by the very clay everyone told you to dig out. But the next number is the one crop that clay is more famous for than almost any other, the backbone of the whole clay garden. Number 5 is the crop clay was made for. Number 5 is the family of crops that heavy clay grows better than almost any other soil on earth, the brassicas, cabbage, broccoli, kale, cauliflower, and Brussels sprouts. If clay has a signature crop, this is it, and there are two solid reasons for it. First, brassicas are hungry, thirsty, heavy feeders that crop for months, and they want a rich, moisture-holding soil that will not dry out or starve halfway through, which is heavy clay to a T. Second, and this is the one nobody tells you, the tall brassicas, the sprouting broccoli and the Brussels sprouts, get top-heavy and catch the wind, and they need firm ground gripping their roots or they rock loose and blow over. On a light, loose soil you have to stake and firm them constantly. On heavy clay the soil grips them like a vice and holds them dead steady, which is exactly why the old growers always said Brussels sprouts want the firmest, heaviest ground you have got. Open a bed of clay with mulch, plant your brassicas firmly into it, and let the clay do the feeding and the anchoring for you. Here is the spike, and it is a big one. A single bed of brassicas on heavy clay can hand you cabbages, heads of broccoli, kale, and standing rows of Brussels sprouts right through the autumn and deep into winter, the exact greens that cost a fortune fresh and that most people never dream they could grow, all off the ground that was supposed to be useless. The soil everyone told you to replace is the soil these crops want most, but the next number is the sprawling heavy feeder that gorges on everything that heavy clay is holding and gives you an armful off a single plant. Number 4 is the crop that gorges on clay. Number 4 is the crop that treats a rich clay bed like an all-you-can-eat buffet, the squash family, courgettes, marrows, pumpkins, and winter squash. If there is one group of crops that can turn everything heavy clay is holding into sheer bulk of food, it is this one. Squash and pumpkins are greedy, thirsty, heavy feeders. They drink and eat enormously to throw out those big sprawling vines and swell those heavy fruits, and on a light sandy soil you are forever watering and feeding them to keep up. Here is why the clay wins, and it is the payoff that makes this number. A clay bed is a reservoir of exactly the water and the food a squash is desperate for, so it holds the moisture around those thirsty roots and hands over the nutrients as fast as the plant can take them, which is precisely the growing power a squash needs to gorge itself and bulk up. Open a generous pocket of the clay with plenty of compost, plant one squash or courgette or pumpkin into it, mulch around it and stand back because they sprawl. Here is the spike. One healthy courgette plant on rich clay can hand you a glut you struggle to give away, and a single pumpkin or winter squash plant can swell you heavy fruits that store for months through the winter, all the filling, expensive squash you rebuy from the shop, grown off ground that was written off as dead, and the big sprawling leaves shade the clay and keep it cool and moist underneath while they crop. You have turned the useless heavy ground into the most productive corner of the plot. But the next number is the genuinely surprising one, the crop that does not just tolerate heavy clay, it actively prefers it, and it comes back every single year on its own. Number 3 is the one that prefers clay. Number 3 is the one that flips it completely, because these are not crops that merely put up with clay, they actively love it, the perennial crops, led by rhubarb. Here is the whole secret and the reason to grow them on purpose in the heavy ground. Rhubarb is a big, hungry, thirsty perennial, and it positively thrives in a rich, moisture-holding heavy soil. A deep clay bed is close to its idea of heaven, and it will sit there and crop for you every spring for years, decades even, off the very ground everyone else gave up on. And rhubarb is not alone. Comfrey, the great fertility plant you can cut again and again to feed the rest of the garden, grows like a weed in heavy clay. Perennial kale and other cut-and-come-again perennials settle happily into it. Even asparagus, which wants better drainage, will crop for years in clay if you simply ridge it up into a raised mound so its crown sits high and drains. Here is why the clay wins, and it is the surprise that makes the whole video worth watching. These are permanent crops. They put their roots down deep once and stay, so the deep, moisture-holding, nutrient-rich clay is a bottomless larder they tap into year after year with almost nothing from you, no replanting, no digging, no yearly bill. Open one corner of the clay, plant your rhubarb crown, your comfrey, your perennial greens, mulch them thick, and largely leave them alone. Here is the spike. A single clay corner of perennials can hand you rhubarb every spring, cutting greens through the season, and comfrey to feed the whole rest of the plot, coming back every year on its own from the ground you were told to throw away. A permanent larder, planted once, off solid clay. But if the perennials are the surprise, the last two numbers are the heavy hitters, the two that actually earn the word never. Number 2 is the heavy staple that breaks the clay for you. Before I count down the last two, stop and look at what that hard clay bed is already holding. A bed of leafy greens and chard staying lush while a sandy plot bolts, a living wall of broad beans and peas up a string feeding the soil as they climb, the brassica backbone standing firm and cropping right into winter on ground that grips them like a vise, a sprawling glut of squash and courgettes and pumpkins gorging on the clay, and a permanent corner of rhubarb and perennials that come back every year on their own. That is already the freshest and some of the most expensive corners of the cart, all grown in heavy clay that everybody told you would grow nothing at all. And the last two numbers are the heavy hitters, the two that turn the whole idea on its head, the heavy staple you lug home in a sack, that actually breaks the clay open for you as it grows, and at number 1, the crop that roots best of all in moisture-holding clay and hands you a lifetime larder off the useless ground. Quick question while we are here, and I do read every reply. How bad is the clay where you are, and what is the one crop you always assumed clay would kill? Tell me in the comments. I am genuinely curious. Now, number 2. Number 2 is the heavy, filling staple crop that most people never dream they could grow in clay, and that actually does you a favor while it grows, the potato, and main crop potatoes above all. Here is the honest bit that makes this the perfect number 2. Everyone assumes potatoes want light, loose ground, but a main crop potato is a strong, hungry crop that crops heavily in the rich, moisture-holding clay, and it does something no other crop on this list does. As the plants bulk up and you earth them up, and above all when you lift them, all that root growth and all that digging fractures and opens the heavy clay, so the potato is quite literally breaking the ground open for you and leaving it looser and better than it found it, ready for next year. It is one of the classic first crops on new clay ground for exactly that reason. Open a strip of the clay, or just lay your seed potatoes on top, and heap a thick mound of compost and mulch over them the no-dig way, and let them grow. Here is the spike. One row of main crop potatoes on heavy clay can hand you a sack of a heavy, filling staple that stores for months, the exact potatoes you lug home from the shop trip after trip, and when you tip them out you get a double win. A haul of clean potatoes and a patch of clay left broken open and better for it. The heaviest, most rebought corner of the whole cart, grown off the ground nobody wanted, that pays you back by improving itself. But the crop at number one is the one that flips the whole idea in your head, the heaviest, most permanent payoff of all, that roots best of any crop in the moisture-holding clay everyone told you to dig out. Here is number one. Number one is the heaviest, most permanent, most expensive payoff you can grow, and the one that heavy clay is genuinely best of all for fruit trees and fruit bushes. Here is why it is the perfect number one. While the shop sells you soft fruit in tiny plastic punnets for a small fortune, and apples and pears by the bag, top fruit and soft fruit actually root best in a deep, moisture-holding, nutrient-rich soil, and that is heavy clay to the letter. Apple, pear, and plum trees anchor rock solid in firm clay and tap its steady water and food to crop heavily year after year, and the soft fruit is even better suited. Black currants, red currants, and gooseberries are hungry, thirsty bushes that positively thrive in rich, heavy, moisture-holding clay, cropping like mad off the ground everyone said was dead. The one thing to get right is simple. On the very heaviest, wettest clay you plant trees and bushes on a slightly raised mound so the roots sit up out of any winter waterlogging, and then the clay does everything else. Plant a couple of bushes and a small tree, mulch them thick, and largely leave them. Here is the payoff I opened the whole video on, the one that flips it in your head. A few fruit bushes and a tree on heavy clay can hand you punnets of currants and gooseberries every summer and armfuls of apples, pears, or plums every autumn for decades, off the exact ground you were told to barrow away and replace, the single most expensive, most permanent corner of the whole shopping, growing itself on useless clay. That is number one, and that is the countdown. Now here is how you run all seven so it actually replaces the shopping instead of just surviving on bad ground. Here is the part that ties 7 crops into one working garden instead of 7 separate beds, and it is the reason a patch of heavy clay can genuinely keep you out of the vegetable aisle. The whole thing comes down to one idea. You do not fight the clay, you match the crop to it, and you open it instead of replacing it. Heavy clay hands you 3 gifts a light, hungry, thirsty, sandy soil fights all year to get. It holds its own water and food. It anchors your tall crops firm against the wind, and it is a deep nutrient bank you only have to unlock, and it is brutal on exactly one thing, the long, straight roots like carrots and parsnips, plus it is hard to work at the wrong moment. So the system is 4 simple rules. First, grow the clay lovers, not the loose soil crops. Fill the ground with brassicas, squash, potatoes, beans, leafy greens and chard, rhubarb and perennials, and fruit, the whole side of the shopping that actually wants rich, heavy, moisture-holding soil, and do not waste the clay fighting to grow long, straight carrots and parsnips that were only ever going to fork in it. Grow those few in a tub of loose compost instead. Second, this is the big one. Open the clay, never dig it to death, go no dig, lay a thick mulch of compost, leaves, or well-rotted manure on top, and let the worms and the roots pull it down and open the structure for you. because digging heavy clay over and over just smears it and makes it worse, while mulching turns it crumbly and rich over a season or two. Third, work it only at the right moment, never wet, never walk on, dig or plant heavy clay when it is sopping wet, because you will smear it into airless glue. Wait until it is just moist and crumbly, and once it is mulched and no dig, you barely disturb it at all. Fourth, on the wettest, heaviest clay, plant up, not down. Bring in raised beds or plant trees, bushes, and asparagus on slightly raised mounds so their roots sit above any winter waterlogging and the clay below still feeds and waters them. Do those four things and a hard clay plot turns, season by season, into the richest, most water-retentive, lowest maintenance ground you will ever grow on, which is the only way 7 crops add up to a real dent in the shopping. And one quiet bonus of clay you will come to love. Once it is opened and mulched, it holds water and food so well that it is one of the most forgiving soils there is in a dry summer, while your sandy soil neighbor is out there watering every single night. So that is the countdown. 7 vegetables you can grow in heavy clay and stop buying. Fast leafy greens and chard for your first win off the cool, moist clay. A living wall of broad beans and peas that feed the soil as they climb. The brassica backbone that clay grips firm and feeds through winter. A sprawling glut of squash and courgette and pumpkin gorging on the rich ground. A permanent corner of rhubarb and perennials that actually prefer clay. The heavy staple maincrop potatoes that break the clay open for you. And at number 1, the fruit trees and bushes that root best of all in moisture-holding clay and pay you back for decades. This channel is called 1 Acre Blueprint, and by now the real lesson is clear. The blueprint was never really about the acre, and it was never about having the perfect, easy, crumbly soil. It is about how hard each square foot works, and a patch of hard, cracked, written-off heavy clay, planted with the crops that were built for it instead of the ones that were not, and opened instead of replaced, can keep a family out of the vegetable aisle year after year. Do not try to build all 7 at once. Start with 1 this week, a bed of leafy greens and chard for a crop in a few weeks, or a single rhubarb crown in the corner that will feed you every spring for years, or a mulch of compost over 1 strip of clay to start opening it up. Subscribe to stay on the 1 Acre Blueprint, because next we take this exact idea somewhere else the world swears nothing grows, and the crops that quietly prove them wrong. And tell me in the comments, of these 7, which would you grow in your clay first?